You use a list to minimize programming effort to output data. Lists take into account the special requirements of business data in the following ways. Lists can be designed for a number of languages. For example, texts and headers appear in the logon language whenever a corresponding translation is available. Lists can display monetary values in the appropriate currency. The following options are available when outputting a list. Screen. You can add colors and icons to the screen. Printer. You can print lists, internet or intranet. You can have the system convert the list to HTML format. Save. You can save lists within the SAP system as well as outside, for example, for processing using spreadsheet programs. The standard user interface for a list offers a range of functions. You can use the menu painter to adapt the default list interface to your own needs. More information is available in the documentation for this tool and in the corresponding training course.
For executable programs or reports in particular, you have the option of maintaining a single-line list header and up to 4 rows of column headers in addition to the text symbols for the classic ABAP list. Together with text symbols and selection texts, list and column headers belong to the text elements of a program. For initial maintenance of the headers, you have to activate your program, then create the list by executing the program. You can maintain the headers directly above your list using System List List Header. The next time you start the program, they will appear in the list automatically. To change the maintained header or to follow up maintenance, you do not have to start the program again and generate the list. Instead, starting from the editor in which you load the program, you can access the maintenance environment for changing the headers by choosing Go to Text Elements List Headers. To translate list and column headers from within the ABAP editor, choose Go to Translation.
You use selection screens for entering selection criteria for data selection. For example, if the program creates a list of data from a very large database table, it makes sense for users to select the data records they actually require and for the system to read only this data from the database. Apart from reducing the memory requirement, this also reduces the net workload. From a technical perspective, selection screens are DIN-pros. However, the developer does not design them directly with the screen painter. The system generates them in accordance with declarative statements in the source code.
The selection screen has the following standard functions. You can maintain texts on the selection screen in several languages. At runtime, the system displays the texts in the user's logon language. You can enter any type of input field on the selection screen. However, if you enter something that does not correspond to the type of the input field, the SAP GUI will ignore it. You can implement complex selections using select options on the selection screen in addition to single value entries or parameters. The user can then enter intervals, comparative conditions, or even patterns as restrictions. You can display the field documentation for the input field by pressing F1 if the developer defines the input field using a dictionary element, for example, data element. You can call the search help attached to the dictionary type to display possible inputs by pressing F4. You can save completed selection screens as variants for reuse or use in background operations. The figure illustrates the use of selection options which enable complex entries. For more information about the operation in question, choose the Help on-screen push button on the additional screen for multiple selections. If an input field is typed with a data element, the following additional semantic information is available on the selection screen. The long field label of the data element can be adopted to describe the input field on the selection screen or selection text. The documentation of the data element is automatically available as input help, that is F1. The search help is available as input help, that is F4, if it is linked to the data element. The semantic information of the data element is available on the selection screen if you type an input field with a structure field. The structure field is defined using a data element. For more information, refer to the online documentation for the ABAP dictionary.
On the selection screen, the names of the input fields appear as their description by default. However, you can replace these with corresponding selection texts and then translate these texts into any other languages you require. At runtime, the system displays selection texts in the logon language of the user or automatic language. Just like list headers and text symbols, selection texts belong to the text elements of the program. From the ABAP editor, choose Go to, Text Elements, Selection Texts to maintain them. You can implement your translation using Go to Translation. If you type the input field directly or indirectly with a data element, you can take over the long field name from one of the texts stored in the ABAP dictionary by selecting Dictionary Reference checkbox. This provides you with an easy option for standardizing texts for all selection screens.
The figure illustrates the usage and the runtime behavior of an input variable defined using a parameter statement. The definition of such an input variable creates a variable in the system and generates a selection screen with a corresponding input option. The only difference between defining an input variable and an ordinary variable is that the parameters keyword is used instead of data. Take the following aspects into consideration. The name of the input variable may be up to 8 characters long. The input variable must not be typed with the standard types F, string, and X string. The assignment of a default value is implemented with the default addition, not the value addition. The system displays a default value assignment by means of the default addition or value assignment. Then, the system displays the selection screen or initialization as a default value that can be overwritten. For example, if the user enters a value and chooses the Execute push button, the system transfers the input value to the internal variable. The system can then be used to restrict the database selection.
You can use the Select Options name for Data Object statement to define a selection option for entering complex selections where name is the name of the select option and data object is a predefined variable. Such a definition creates an internal table of the specified name within the program, namely car, and generates a selection screen with an input option for limiting the specified variable, namely GSSPFLI car ID. The system transports user entries to the automatically generated internal table when you choose the Execute push button. The internal table has 4 columns: Sign, Option, Low, and High. The figure illustrates the following entries created for user input. If LH is entered, a row is generated with the values I for inclusive, EQ for equal, LH, and space. If the interval AA to DL is entered, a row is generated with the values I for inclusive, BT for between, AA and DL. If BA is entered as the single value to be excluded, a row is generated with the values E for exclusive, EQ for equal, BA and space. Once the internal table has been filled with the selection criteria, it can be used to limit the database selection as shown in the figure. When you start an ABAP program, the system creates all global data objects of the programs in the working memory. The runtime system then triggers various events in succession. If a processing block exists for a triggered event in the program, the system executes the statements in this block in sequence. The figure illustrates the basic events that are triggered, the sequence in which they are triggered, and how the system implements the corresponding processing blocks in the program. An executable ABAP program is thus a collection of processing blocks that are processed for the respective events. Outputs created by means of write statements are stored in list buffers and only displayed as a list after the system has processed the start of selection block.
If you assign values to the parameters variables in the initialization block, the system displays these as changeable default values in the input fields when the selection screen is subsequently displayed. You have the option of specifying a default value for the respective input field in the parameters definition by means of the default addition. However, you can use the value assignment described in the initialization block to assign another default value or dynamic pre-population of the selection screen dynamically, that is, with reference to the situation. If the user clicks a push button on the selection screen, thus triggering process after input, or PAI, the system transports the entries into the corresponding internal parameters variables of the program and triggers the Add Selection Screen event. The corresponding processing block is therefore suitable for an input or authorization check. If, for example, a type E message is sent in this event block because a user does not have the required authorization, the selection screen will be displayed again with the error message allowing users to correct their entries. Only if no error message is sent in, the Add Selection Screen block is Start Off Selection then triggered.
Event block characteristics, introduced with an event keyword, ends by beginning the next processing block, cannot be nested. Existence is not absolutely necessary. Sequence of event blocks is unimportant. Implicit standard event block in executable program, start of selection. If no blocks are implemented in the program, the system assigns all statements to the standard processing block, start of selection.
The example illustrated here contains a selection screen with an input field for a date. Under normal circumstances, the current date should appear as the default value or default SY datum. However, under certain conditions, such as if the date of the same weekday of the following week, for example, PA date is equal to PA date plus 7, is to be displayed as the default value. The figure also illustrates how the runtime system reacts when the processing block is missing. There are no statements executed for the corresponding event and the next event is triggered.
From the selection screen, the Add Selection Screen event is triggered both by choosing Enter as well as F8 or Execute. After the corresponding processing block has been processed, if you choose the Execute push button, the following Start of Selection event is triggered and the processing starts. However, if you choose Enter, the system again displays the selection screen.
Immediately before processing the Add Selection Screen block, the system transfers user entries to the corresponding variables in the program. Hence, it makes sense to implement required input and authorization checks in this processing block. If the check result is negative, you can simply send out an error message to the user and have the selection screen displayed again. The user then has the chance to make new entries. In contrast, the system generates an error message in the Start of Selection block on program termination. The figure illustrates a simple example program with an authorization check and an error dialog on the selection screen.
Additional information can be found in the keyword documentation for Add Selection Screen.